So, Michaela, if you could please share your screen whenever you are ready.
Sure. Let me start with a quick warning. Unfortunately, I experienced some connectivity issues this morning. So give me a sign that you hear me clearly now.
Yeah.
Okay, and don't hesitate to interrupt me whenever you think you're losing me. It's usually coming back quite quickly, but just in case.
Okay. So yeah, whenever you are ready, you can start.
Okay, I think I'm ready. So thanks for giving me the chance to give this talk here at this conference. My name is Michaela Egli. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Geneva in Switzerland, where I write my PhD about methods in clinical research that make use of data from routine clinical care to generate knowledge. Now, today's presentation is going to be about the pragmatic clinical trials and whether these clinical trials can measure effectiveness. And I hope you will see soon why this question might be slightly different from when we approach ideal clinical trials. My talk is split into 3 parts. I will first give you a short introduction into what people say about these pragmatic clinical trials and why they are so useful. Then in the second part, I will take a conceptual perspective on 2 desiderata of these trials. I will first look at effectiveness and try to show how the conceptual perspective suggests that effectiveness differs from efficacy primarily in the scope. And I will also introduce the problem of extrapolation and suggest how pragmatic trials might be able to respond to that problem. And then only in the third part, I'll take a methodological perspective. I introduce the pragmatic clinical trial design a little more closely, and I will then look again at external validity of these designs and how this might or may not provide a solution to the problem at hand. And I will also ask the question again, now what is it really that pragmatic trials measure? And you will see that my answer is going to be effectiveness, but of a different kind as the conceptual perspective would suggest. Now, let me begin by introducing the problem. The big problem I think clinical research is dealing with nowadays is that most clinical trials are useless. And the challenge is to make research findings simply more useful for medical care, which is an interest that has been boosted very much by policymakers and funded as well. There's a lot of money in boosting initiatives to respond to the challenge. And pragmatic trials are one answer among many other what I call agenda setting initiatives, including many good things like, for example, foster patient involvement to make research findings more relevant. Now, because of this interest, we experience, I think, an upswing of pragmatic trials, but also of the whole importance of that notion of usefulness within clinical research. And there is a shift that has also been called the rise of pragmatism. Now, what is the problem? This is just a simple illustration of one of the problems that pragmatic trials are trying to address, where we have, at the one hand, clinical research that looks at a very highly selected aspect of medical reality, mostly homogeneous study groups in a very standardized context. And then there is a big question mark that arises of how we can apply evidence that is true of such contexts to another context, which is clinical practice, and where patients are much more heterogeneous. Now, that problem comes with different names. I think philosophers prefer the problem of extrapolation, but sometimes you also hear the problem of external validity. And in medicine and I think other policy-related fields, you hear the efficacy effectiveness gap. And I will approach the issue by making use of all of these 3 terms, although not in the exact same way. Now, what people say about pragmatic trials, why they are of value, is that they are advocated as providing reliable and directly useful evidence. So most importantly, people say about pragmatic trials that they have high external validity, that they provide direct evidence of effectiveness for medical treatments. Kirsten Bergeson has argued that they are of direct social value and therefore to be preferred to ideal trials. And Jeremy Hovick has also briefly proposed that pragmatic trials may respond to the problem of extrapolation. So now in the second part, I will look at these two desiderata. As I said, this is going to be a conceptual perspective. A usual way to define effectiveness in the clinical research literature is in contrast with efficacy. So this is really a common definition of both terms that we find here in Eichler et al., where they write that efficacy describes how a drug performs under conditions of clinical trials, whereas effectiveness describes how it performs under conditions of everyday clinical practice. Now, if we look a little closer at these statements and analyze them in a simple way, I think this is what we get. We have efficacy, where we have a drug that performs somehow, so it causes some outcome in a specific context. Here, the context is the one of a clinical trial. And we can be generous at this point and say that this context can be sufficiently described by the background conditions as they were specified, for example, in the study protocol. Looking at effectiveness, things appear pretty similar. We have effectiveness describes how it performs under conditions of everyday clinical practice. So we still have a drug that causes some outcome now under different conditions, which are the conditions of clinical practice. Now, of course, there is huge practice variability, and the level of expertise or infrastructure or standard care differs from one practice setting to another. So we might want to take this analysis a little further and say that effectiveness is in fact some drug that causes an outcome in one practice setting, in another, and so on and so forth. Now, the idea behind this analysis seems to suggest that effectiveness claims hold in a variety of background conditions, and also large changes of background conditions may not disrupt the causal dependency of this drug causing its outcome. And we can call this an analysis that is reminiscent of the idea of causal stability, if I may borrow this notion from Woodward. We can look at effectiveness from a slightly different perspective. So Jacob Segenga has proposed as well that medical interventions underlie different scope requirements. And he says that it's a usual way of thinking about these terms that effectiveness is a more general property that has the capacity to manifest in settings more general and less controlled as compared with efficacy. So for me, the main point of the conceptual perspective is that this seems to suggest that efficacy and effectiveness, they differ in the scope of the background conditions in which they hold, or if you prefer, they differ in causal stability. And the causal relata within these causal statements are of the same type. So we predicate efficacy and effectiveness of the same thing. Now, of course, the difference in scope or the difference in stability are very desirable features, as they rely to the notion of a law and may in fact help to make predictions for other settings and other patients. So if pragmatic trials really can provide reliable evidence for such effectiveness claims, there's no doubt that they would be truly of value. Now, let's look at the problem of extrapolation that is also attributed to pragmatic trials to provide a solution to. This is a simple inference scheme. I think the problem of extrapolation is concerned with. We start with a premise, like premise 1 here, that some drug causes some outcome in one context, and from there we would like to infer that the drug will also cause the same outcome in a different context. Now, while it's easy to solve such inferences theoretically, here the suggestion is that we can simply add a second premise that states that one context is sufficiently similar to the other context. The hard work, of course, only begins when we try to figure out what means sufficiently similar. and also what kind of research practices can establish that this premise is in fact true. Now, Jonathan Fuller and Jacob Segenga both have very convincingly shown why it is fallacious to assume that this inference holds based on ideal trials. And based on doubts like this, many people have discussed more promising strategies of how to establish that this second premise in fact holds. Now, the suggestion here would simply be to say pragmatic clinical trials can, namely by means of their high external validity, they could provide at once evidence for premise 1, that the drug causes some outcome in one context, and for premise 2, namely that this context is sufficiently similar to another context. And now in this third part, I'll introduce the trial design and try to make approach the question whether pragmatic trials really can uphold to these desiderata. So what is the pragmatic clinical trial? According to a state-of-the-art view, clinical trials can be situated on an explanatory pragmatic continuum. Now, irregardless of where on this scale trials situate, explanatory and pragmatic trials are said to have certain things in common. Namely, they're all interventional, they're all controlled, and mostly they are all randomized. They differ, however, widely when you look at these trials and compare their homogeneity versus the heterogeneity that is allowed in the study. And according to a PRCTS2 tool, this is exactly the state-of-the-art view that I mentioned before, we can observe this difference across 9 domains. And here I'd like to introduce you just to 3 of these domains to give you a feel of how these trial designs in fact differ. The first domain is eligibility of patients. This is, I guess, the most well-known and the most discussed domain of pragmatic trials. So usually for explanatory trials, they select a very homogeneous study group with very good compliance, who are very likely to respond well to the treatment. Whereas for pragmatic trials, it's basically everyone who has a clinical diagnosis and would receive the treatment in clinical care who is allowed to participate in the trial. Now, pragmatism, however, does not stop with eligibility. It concerns, for example, also the setting. So here is for explanatory trial, the setting that is chosen are usually university hospitals, because at university hospitals is the staff who knows how to do research. But it happens that university hospitals are very well equipped. They have on average very well educated staff. So you might expect that these provide on average above average level of care. So for pragmatic trials, the guiding principle is to select the kind of settings that are those which would also administer the treatment once it's on the market. So if you're examining a treatment that is administered in general practices by general practitioners, this is the very kind of setting you should do your research with. And now a third domain that I even like to highlight, because I think this is particularly important, is the flexibility of the treatment administration. So here again, for explanatory trials, you usually have a very standardized way to do this. So in terms of dosage, timing, and co-medication, these things are all clearly defined in the study protocol, and there's no wiggle room there. Now for pragmatic trials, these kind of decisions may be up to the healthcare provider, who is in that case also the investigator. So if a healthcare provider thinks that some dosage for some patients might be more beneficial, he or she is usually perfectly fine to take such a decision in a pragmatic trial. Now, this is to show you that there is really a huge heterogeneity in pragmatic trials, even regarding what we would call the core intervention here, so this administration of the treatment. But it is not only heterogeneity for its own sake, always with regards to a standard that is set by usual care or routine clinical practice. So the principle, the guiding practical principle is just as things would be done in practice is how they should be done in the clinical trial. And we could think of pragmatic trials as being governed by a principle of non-interference in this usual care setting. Now, I think it's precisely the principle of non-interference which justifies, at least to some degree, that the premise that the research setting is sufficiently similar to the target setting by diminishing the worry that there are causally relevant differences between the two. And it's also that complex of design properties that are governed by this principle which constitute the so-called external validity of the trial. So, looking back at our inference scheme, it looks like external validity of pragmatic trial ticks off the second premise and thereby licenses the extrapolation. However, there's another problem coming in, which I will now elaborate briefly. This is the problem that not people say, but the problem is well recognized, that there is a trade-off between external validity and what we call internal validity. From a practical perspective, this is because to increase the similarity of the study to the target context, what I call external validity, it is usually necessary to design the trial exactly in the opposite way as it would be to justify the conclusion to the single cause-effect relationship. And this is what we would call internal validity. Now, I'd like to suggest that this is a truly epistemic trade-off, and emphasizing one or the other leads to changing the subject matter of the study, simply because the trade-off hinges on the fact that internal validity requires to control the complexity of the experimental situation, whereas external validity requires to conduct research in a setting that is complexity-wise comparable with the real world. So unless we live in a world which is governed only by single cause-effect relationships, there's always going to be this trade-off, and I don't think how you can have it both. I just empathize this because sometimes you hear that people say it's only an inconvenient sort of practical trade-off, and somehow we could have it otherwise. Okay, so what this comes down is to say that pragmatic trials may tick off this second premise, but we now have troubles with the first premise. And this is now precisely the last part of my talk that I want to get to give you one suggestion what I think pragmatic trials in fact measure and how this first premise looks like for pragmatic trials. I do this by discussing a case study, which is the SALFORD lung study. The study was testing the effectiveness of a dry powder inhaler to treat asthma and chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. So these were two different trials, but the same treatment was applied and the same settings were used. And this trial is on the very pragmatic end of the spectrum. So the study is in line with the principle of non-interference to prevent the similarity with the routine care setting. So there were very few eligibility criteria, 75 general practices participated. The principal investigators were general practitioners, and also they had no additional follow-up meetings to what was necessary by usual care anyway. Now, the intervention they investigated combined two innovations. So there was the pharmacological combination, and also its once daily application as compared to twice daily with other treatments. They conducted the trial, and then they found that the treatment reduces the number of exacerbations, and concluded that this trial shows that broad populations of patients with COPD benefit from treatment with that inhaler. Now, while this is not very surprising, the striking point here, I think, lies in this two-folded innovation of the intervention. And this becomes very clear if we look, for example, at a publication that discussed the study protocol going with this trial, where the investigator said, the once daily combination has the potential for improved adherence over the currently available twice daily combinations, with improved clinical effectiveness in a real-world setting. And in case this has not been clear enough, we could look again at the conclusion section of the publication, where they write, this comparative effectiveness trial that was conducted in a population of patients with COPD was largely unsupervised over the year-long period, which allowed important factors in usual clinical care, such as adherence, frequency of dosing, and persistence of good inhaler technique to come into play. So the point they're getting at is that the treatment has potential for improved effectiveness precisely because it has the potential to improve adherence. Now, this should in fact not come as a surprise, at least not for clinical researchers who are familiar with pragmatic clinical trials. These trials have been advocated from the very beginning to test treatment strategies and not the effect of a drug. So if we look at the very first publication that in fact introduced the term pragmatic trial from Swartz and Lelouch in 1967, they write, "It is characteristic of the pragmatic approach that the treatments are flexibly defined and absorb into themselves the context in which they are administered." Now, what does this suggest for our understanding of effectiveness as measured in pragmatic clinical trials? I think effectiveness here is the complex interactions between patients, treatments, physicians, and social and institutional factors, and the hopefully resulting benefit for patients. And the important point is that these factors play a central causal role and are not just part of the background conditions. So if we look at this short analysis before that I proposed, where we had efficacy and effectiveness as 2 times the drug that causes some outcome in either a small scope or a wider scope of background conditions, I suggest that the method-driven perspective would suggest such an analysis where effectiveness is in fact the event of prescribing the drug that causes the outcome, again in a context which is here relative to the clinical trial context, although here the clinical trial was a pragmatic trial. So just to sum up and to try to make some suggestions how to go on from here, what is it that pragmatic trials really measure? I think it's effectiveness. I don't see any reasons why we should not think of effectiveness in this way when we look at pragmatic trials. However, we need to be aware that in the context of pragmatic trials, it's not the same kind of effectiveness as the conceptual perspective would probably suggest. Here, effectiveness is the event of prescribing a treatment, and this event, of course, includes a cluster of causes, and the contribution of the single causes remains unknown. And it might be that the pharmacological properties of the treatment do not play a causal role at all. However, a short side note, since pragmatic trials, they measure comparative effectiveness, I don't think that this is such a big problem, but this is just a side note. I think taking the complex interactions with the social and institutional factors is important, as it can account also for increasing evidence of their central causal role. And I would suggest why not join clinical researchers in their enthusiasm for usefulness and support their efforts by providing an epistemology for pragmatic trials that is useful for them, which may, and this now really concludes my presentation, may suggest some future philosophical problems to deal with. For example, to develop a notion of a usual care intervention. We really want to say that pragmatic trials are interventional trials, but they cannot uphold to our ideal notion of ideal intervention. So perhaps to revise what is really going on the level of the notion of an intervention, or also look a little more critically at this similarity premise and to what extent it really can hold when we try to extrapolate from pragmatic trials. So thank you for your attention. And now I am looking forward to some comments or questions.
Thank you, Michaela. So again, I encourage you to raise your hand using the participants, and so I don't see any hands raised right now, but let me start. So my question concerns sort of a if you could say more about how effective some of these drugs that have undergone the pragmatic clinical trials, so how sort of effective they have been in comparison to those that are only tested using the ideal conditions of the clinical trial. So sort of the efficacy of a drug may perform well in a clinical trial settings, but then as soon as it hits the market, this, because of all the causal factors, including the sort of regime, the treatment regime, and all that, once it's, for instance, prescribed by a general practitioner, so then the benefit may be lower because of not upholding to these regimes, or of course because of the differences of the individuals. So I wonder how different really this is when it comes to the pragmatic clinical trials.
So how different in really empirical, broad scope kind of answer? This is not what I can provide. Usually, I mean, this is exactly the point you were hitting at, is usually that, yes, drugs are tested within ideal RCTs for efficacy, and then they go into the market, and there are a lot of causal factors that in fact even diminish more the effectiveness of these drugs, right? So they interfere with the effect, and which causes the drug to be not effective at all on the market. This is one big problem why the idea for this pragmatic trial even arose, and why the need for what is called comparative effectiveness on the market arose. But I think the case study that I've used shows very well that it's not only diminishing effectiveness sometimes, but it can also be what has been called a driver of effectiveness. For example, for these asthma treatments, it is, I think, that once these treatments are on the market, adherence is about 40%. When they're tested in a clinical trial, in an ideal trial, patients are so heavily monitored that adherence goes up to 90%. But then, of course, once they're introduced on the market, it goes down to 40% again. So here, the improved adherence really is a driver of effectiveness as compared with other treatments that were on the market. So this may also call a little bit into question this standard view that we have, that ideal trials only they test a pure effect, and then once they're in the market, these other factors only diminish the effect that we observed, that we would observe otherwise.
And just to follow up on this, so the sort of inclusion criteria, well, not the inclusion criteria, but rather the sample. So how big the samples are, because these drugs, of course, they are clinically tested, so they can't be really offered to they are not on the market yet. So then is this the same when it comes to the sample size as with normal clinical trials?
Yes, very important question. Thank you. And this is an information I withhold from you. So mostly nowadays, pragmatic trials are post-market studies. So they compare the effectiveness of treatments who are already on the market. So we already have also evidence from ideal RCTs that suggests that there is at least efficacy. So usually they are no longer test or pre-market test treatments, and we know that they are supposed to be safe and also effective, at least in the artificial context. Nevertheless, because of course there is much more variance within clinical practice, these sample sizes tend to be much bigger than with clinical trials. But there is no threshold or anything that you have to hit as to count for pragmatic trials. This is just adjusts the power or the sample size to the power on the variance you expect.
So it's basically sort of the phase 4 stage, sort of different because of course it's a clinical trial again, rather than just reporting the side effects, for instance, or that from the general practitioner.
Exactly.
But it's up post phase 3. So once it's been approved.
Mostly. So it's again not necessary. It's not necessary. So the case study that I used, that was in fact the first phase 3 pre-market trial. So the sponsors were really, I mean, actually, they were counting on that adherence effect. That's what I get from their publications. But usually, mostly, yes, they are post-market trials.
There's time for one question. So if anyone is eager to ask it right now, or perhaps in the break. I don't see anyone raising his or her hand. So, and neither there is a question in the chat. So I guess let's wrap up, and thank you again, Michaela, for your presentation.
Thank you.